Hey everybody, welcome to the What is Money show. I'm sitting down today with Mr. Tuur Demeester. Tuur, it's been a long time coming. Welcome to the show.
I'm excited to be here. Hey, Robert.
Glad to have you. Most of my audience probably knows you because a lot of us are Bitcoiners, but in case they don't, Tuur is a well-known Bitcoiner, been around for many years, would also give you the labels of economist, investor, philosopher. And I think we're going to try to have an interesting dialogue today about some topics you and I have both been thinking about, and we'll hopefully push the edges of our own understanding and break some new ground. With that said, where should we start? We have this outline here that says, why do we think philosophy is important? Seems like
Yeah,
a good
well, first I was going to say, I would not call myself a philosopher. I mean,
That's why I called you the philosopher.
if
People
I
do the
would,
same thing to me.
I'd say I'm deeply, deeply closeted. No, but I don't think I'm a philosopher. I don't think I've read enough. I don't think and seriously, I don't think I've written enough. And also, I don't think I've done this enough. Like to have in-depth discussions and debates. And I really think that's needed to earn anything close to a label like that. But I do love, I love philosophy, and I think it's really important. And it's like, and it's something that is, if you learn about it in a context that's like stuffy and boring and academic and like very esoteric, it can just be a turnoff. And that was the case for me for a while. I was like, man, this stuff, at least for a period, I was really turned off by some things. And I even tried, I started studying philosophy in Leuven when I was like 17 at the university. And it went above my head. And I think, and not only that, but the topics just did not resonate with me. It was just stuff that the philosophy is so wide. So I feel like if you can just, if you can link it to something that is really burning inside of you in that time period, and then you find, philosophical content or ideas or concepts, I think that's where it really comes alive, where it gives your life meaning. And in my case, it was mostly about trying to, how do I not become a cynic? Like that was one of my big, missions, is like, how do I avoid that? And then the way to get there was to find truth or things that I really believe are true. And then that is like gravity. Then it's like there's something solid under my feet, and I can choose a direction, and I have agency. So that, to me, that is why personally philosophy is important. And in the big picture, of course, I think it's what probably makes us human, right? I mean, to find knowledge together, and to kind of just kind of grow from unaware to more and more aware, get self-knowledge and knowledge about the world. Yeah, I'm curious what got you on the track of philosophy.
Well, I'd like to first echo back what you said, that I don't consider myself to be a philosopher. Sometimes it gets tweeted or said about me. They say the Bitcoin philosopher, which I'm okay with. If people want to call me that, it's fine. But sometimes they say self-proclaimed or calls himself a philosopher. And I'm like, please don't say that. That's very not true and
Right.
doesn't sound right. So,
Or if anyone calls me Think Boy, I'm gonna wear that with pride. I'll take it. I'll put it on a t-shirt.
I've had a couple of think boys thrown at me too, and had to go to Urban Dictionary or whatever to figure out what it meant. But yeah, I just consider myself extremely curious, and I always have been. And once I picked up the tool of linguistics, and specifically reading on your own, kind of like at the age of, I guess, 11 or 12, when I started to seriously read, I've just been trying to satisfy that curiosity, right? Just reading different things. For me, it started with astronomy and astrophysics. I was like, what in the world is all this? And then it's, as I got older and became more about economics, what's going on in the world history, etc. But my, like, specifically why I'm weak in this topic is I haven't even read the Western canon. You know, I haven't read Plato, I haven't read Aristotle, Spinoza, Heidegger, all of these guys. There's so much I haven't read. I actually have a list put together. It's from a book called, the book's title is How to Read a Book. Sounds like a terrible book, but it's actually really good. And they recommend, they have the Western canon sort of outlined. And they're like, I think it's, if you read, don't quote me on it, but I think it's a couple of hours per day, you can get through this reading list in like 4 or 5 years. And it's basically the whole thing, right? Like all of Western civilization in a reading list. I've read maybe 1% of that. So like, no, I'm not a philosopher. I'm just a guy trying to learn. But I think I am philosophical by nature. My friends have always made fun of me that 2 things. One, that I like to do homework. So that was, you know, I've always, again, just been curious. I like to read, like to write. And then 2, that I wasn't good at small talk, basically. It's always some deep conversation about whatever. So this idea,
so serious, Robert. Why are you always so serious? Did you hear that?
Yeah. I do have a sense of humor. I don't show it enough on this show, but I'll try to do better at that. But this idea of having inquiry into the fundamental nature of things, I mean, like you said, that's almost like your human purpose in some ways. Like we are the animal that can deal with knowledge in a way that no other animal can. So it makes sense that we would scavenge for that knowledge, right? Or inquire into reality and nature and logic and all these things and try to extract it. So it's very enjoyable, just the pursuit, I think, of, again, satisfying that curiosity. But I read this recently. This is a quote, I don't know who said it. That basically, the usefulness of knowledge is always in action, right? It's not so helpful to just know a thing if it doesn't have some practical, praxeological application of some kind, right? Otherwise, you're just, what is it? It's like intellectual masturbation. Like, it doesn't serve any purpose. And so I think with Bitcoin, what's so crazy about Bitcoin is that it's so, I mean, seemingly impossible to get your hands around it. And it shatters your worldview on multiple levels. It's like, well, you thought you knew what money was, or you thought you knew what property was, or the state, or the way the world works, et cetera. It's like Bitcoin's like a pebble thrown into that glass house, I guess. And then you're left kind of picking up the pieces. And when you're picking up the pieces, you're like, well, this structure that I used, this prism that I used to evaluate the world doesn't work anymore. It's broken. So now I have to reestablish my philosophical anchor points to the world and like rebuild a new worldview. So I think, I mean, that's the best articulation I can give for like why philosophy and Bitcoin are so deeply interrelated and very important, because if Bitcoin does succeed, like everything changes.
Yeah.
And when everything changes,
and it really, I like speaking to the paradigm you're talking about, the glass house, you know, like I was very what's the word, gloomy about, you know, the future of the world, because I was reading about these economic cycles. That was like my early research, and I translated this book about the history of banking and all that, and it just seemed like this forever repeating cycle of, you know, they get their act together, there's like full reserve banks, and then it devolves, and then there's more, you know, money printing, and now we live in a purely digital age. So I was like, oh no, this is even more of a nightmare, because then we're gonna have, the world is gonna be like Argentina, where every 10 years there's just a reset. So it's just so depressing. And then Bitcoin was like, whoa, like that gave me hope. It was like, whoa. And I guess to you know, what it started in the very beginning for me, philosophy, was I was terribly depressed when I was 15, 16. And one of the main things that made me feel stuck was determinism. I was struggling with like, am I destined to be, you know, become this person, you know, to be like these people that I see in my everyday life, you know, to get the same kind of afflictions and problems. And I felt stuck in that. And then ultimately it was like, okay, realizing I could just kill myself. Like that's a genuine option. And then it was like, but that was so horrifying. Like that, just, you know, really imagining it, you know, doing that. And then weirdly, that was like the ultimate, like it crystallized the fact that, well, I have a choice. I can do this or not. And also it kind of like everything else became less scary because it was kind of like I have nothing left to lose. But so really like bringing down like really kind of that point of like, oh, like I have a choice. And so that means, and that's kind of what you're saying, I think what you're saying about Bitcoin is like, everything is shattered, but now it's like, I got to build it up again. It's like, okay, well, what if I do have free will? Well, what does that mean? And it's like, I don't know how to do that. I know how to do depressed and determined, you know, I know that, but I don't know this other life. So that to me is where like philosophy became, you know, part of what I use to, and like reading Mises, you know, the Human Action when I was like in my early 20s, early 20s, he's just like, you know, he just says like determinism is bullshit, you know, science is real, the truth actually exists, like these basic things, and he takes them serious and actually spells it out, you know, and like his take on that. And it was so validating. It just blew me away. The first like 200 pages of that book was like, thank you. Like, you know, science, you know, not in the woke sense, you know, science is real, but like
right.
in the sense of like, man, like this stuff is actually, you know, the fabric of our world. You know, we can actually do stuff with this. It's the blueprint of everything that's good and right in the world.
Yeah, well said, and lucky you for discovering Human Action in your 20s. I didn't get that.
Yeah, very lucky
until my early 30s, and it's a very difficult book, but so much in there.
I needed to have it again because I've been moving so often, but I got me another copy again. It's nice to have it.
Nice. How many times have you been through it?
The new one, I've just been browsing it. It's just, it feels good because it's the exact same, you know, font. It's just the old print, you know. So but yeah, a friend of mine actually, he printed it in like 5 because it was free online. So he just printed it in 5 little binders. So I would like, you know, I would work at like a theme park and like just put people in little boats and like read a little more. It really like it was amazing. Yeah.
That is wonderful. And well, thank you for sharing about the suicide thought, because that is, I mean, it's very powerful. And it's interesting there that you discovered the power of choice ultimately, right? It's like it's almost like hitting a rock bottom of just like deciding what you want to do. I was like, well, do you want to live or die? That's kind of your first most fundamental choice before you make any other choice. And also embedded there, I think this is the philosophy that I have read a lot of is Eastern philosophy. So Sun Tzu, Musashi, Lao Tzu, all those guys. One of them said, the way of the warrior is the resolute acceptance of death. So there's something about like really taking in that reality that you're mortal, it's all going to end. There's something so powerful about that in determining what you want to do, right? So because I don't know, the singularness of it, or the one shot, or the, you know, creating something that echoes in the lives of others, you know, the meaningfulness of your life. And it's interesting that both of those things are kind of, they hit, to have the suicidal thought, you're looking at the power of choice and then the acceptance of death at the same time.
Yeah, like I've heard it say that like the most painful thing to lose is illusions. You know, your illusions about the world, like that's the most painful thing. And so if you can lose the illusion that you're going to live forever, or that, you know, you can know for sure that you're not going to run under a bus tomorrow. Like if you can lose that illusion, there's something really powerful to that, because then it's like, well, that pain is not gonna, you work through it once, or maybe
Yes.
repeatedly, but that's not something that's not a pebble somebody can throw at you.
Right. Yeah, and then if you can dispel that illusion, I think you're well equipped to then go into the world and deal with there's so many illusions we're dealing with, right? That's one of the things Bitcoin does. It shatters all of these illusions.
Yeah. Which is why some people are so staunch at being a no-coiner, right? I mean, it's too painful for them to cross the chasm.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also, I would argue, the reason the state is able to coordinate the movements of people through fear. Like if the population in general, and you see this, right? If in a cohort of the population that's deeply religious or deeply spiritual, I'm thinking of like the Bible Belt in the US, those people put God above GOV. So it's harder to corral those people with fear. Like when I was in...
Oh, I see. Yeah. I was trying to spell out God, and I was thinking too far. Got it. God versus government. Got it.
Yeah, exactly. So I was in Nashville for wedding 6 or 8 months ago, peak mask psychosis. And no one gave a shit. No one's wearing a mask. Everyone knows it's pretend. Like everyone knows it's a boogeyman. At least in my experience. Maybe I was in some biased niche of Nashville, but it seemed like everywhere I went, no one was wearing a mask. Everyone was just getting on with their life. But then like flying through LA on the way there, totally different scene, right? People are triple masked. Everyone's freaking out when you get close to them. Like they're living in this illusion.
Right.
And you could argue, oh, is it illusion? Is it not? I think it is. I think it's a flu, basically.
Yeah, and you can argue on different stages of the pandemic or whatever, but ultimately, if you see extremely different reactions, group reactions to the exact same situation on the same day, well, that's saying something about one of those groups, or maybe both.
Yes, exactly. So, I guess when you can accept the reality of death, you can overcome fear. And if you can overcome fear, you can resist psychological manipulation. Like if you don't fear to lose your life.
It's like, in a way, it's like rather than overcome, it's almost like, it's like the fear doesn't need to materialize. You can just kind of accept, and like it's like something that washes over you rather than, that you have to hide from because you think it's going to destroy you.
Yes, exactly.
Because fear, I don't know. I think everybody always has some fear somehow.
Of course. I don't think you can be courageous without the sensation of fear. I mean, courage is not lack of fear. I think courage is just the willingness, the choice, if you will, to face fear.
To do it afraid.
Yeah. And it's I heard a really good, this is from a boxing coach one time. I was doing a little bit of amateur boxing, and you're very scared when you get in the ring and someone's punching you in the face. Like you have nerves, you lose your training and all that. And he said something, his name was Ace Miller. He said something to me one time after a training session. He said, fear is like a fire. If it's uncontrolled, it will burn you up. But to control it is essential to life. So it's like you need to harness that energy of fear and then, I guess approach it courageously and then channel it. And I think, like when you do public speaking, a lot of people feel a lot of fear, especially at the beginning when you first get started. But to harness that energy, to harness that nervousness or whatever it is, put it into your talk.
Yep.
That's what gives it, resonance or something. So it's not like it's something you're trying to avoid or forget about.
Yeah.
You just need to learn to deal with it and channel it.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Aristotelian mean, where you could probably put fear on that and be like, okay, the one extreme is panic, and the other extreme is what's the word again? Where you're just you pretend it's not there, kind of like just
denial or something.
Recklessness or something like that. Where you just and you want to be in the middle, where it's like, yeah, this is scary. It's okay to feel fear, and then it like it's like just part of your engine. Part of what is just because I, like, for example, this conversation I definitely worked through fear about it. It was like, it's like talking about philosophy, and then, but I definitely have like stages, and like it's still somewhere there, I'm trying to not like, I don't know. I feel like I would just be less authentic if I pretended it wasn't there, like, oh, I'm not nervous. What are you talking about? The Brits are like that. Like, oh, what are you talking about? I'm not nervous. And then like that's faulty towers, like, in a nutshell.
That's the illusion, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So on this topic, this is interesting. I've just been playing around in my mind recently where I'm trying to get to the root of fiat itself. And I don't mean just fiat currency. I mean the idea of because I said so, like because an authority said to do something is why you should do it, under the veiled threat of something, coercion, violence, compulsion. So clearly, to be controlled by fiat is a response from fear, right? If someone tells you what to do and it's not something you voluntarily chose to do, you would only comply out of fear of something. But I think also the expression of fiat is an expression of fear, where someone's like, I'm scared what you would do on your own, so you better do what I say instead, something like that.
Right.
Have you thought about that much, the relationship between fiat and
fiat? I mean, I'm thinking off the top of my head because I haven't tried to put it that way. Like, I think there's different things that people do with fear, and I quite like the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, like that kind of I don't know if you're familiar with that's like in psychology and in therapy, like people often talk about it because they're like different fear responses in a way. And ultimately you could say like fear is like, well, your system is encountering something it doesn't want and it's immediately trying to get away from it. And I think even like anger is often layered on top of fear. Like anger is the protector of the fear. So it almost makes it like a bigger emotion than what you would superficially think. Like, oh, fear is when you're shaking. And it's like, well, I think sometimes people look very angry when they're trying to protect, the thing that's feeling vulnerable. But so, yeah. And so the fear responses to me, freeze is, and maybe we'll get into it later, but like I think maybe we should better park it and talk about it once, if we're going to hit on the 4 causes of conflict and then the 4 universal solutions, because to me that overlaps. There's 4 universal strategies to get out of the conflict, to get back to peace or stability. And so to me, those 4 F's, they map onto that. So I don't want to like lose listeners to all of a sudden dive into this technical thing.
Yeah, perfect. We'll work our way towards it. So perhaps now's a good time for this second question of what are good approaches to studying philosophy? Do you have are you methodical about it, or are you more, I guess, flexible or carefree, or somewhere in the middle? How do you approach philosophy?
I one of the things that I noticed when I was like trying to do, because before we started recording, we were talking about like, that, and for me, it's the same, what have we read of the Western canon? Very little, if we really, look at all the books that we haven't read, the classics, so to speak. And so I remember as a teenager being like, Anna Karenina or whatever, like giving myself the task of like, going through it, and I would give up and I would feel bad about myself. Like I would start and I would just not be able to finish it, and I would try that over and over, and eventually I just really, it helped to embrace that I didn't have to do that. I can browse, I can find a chapter that really resonates with me, and I can read chapters in different books just because I'm thinking about this one topic. I can read synopses, like important works very, very often have like readers, it's like some professor who's been studying it for 10 years gives like his summary of that book, you know, and I think it's one of the fallacies is that if you go to university is that you only read the reader of one guy. You never read the source material and you think you know what it is, you know, and it's usually a very kind of bland distillation. And especially in universities I went to, it felt like it was almost like the sharp edges were taken off, you know, it's like, oh, you know, this is what that is. And it's a safe way to, because we're already like, oh yeah, this is what that is because this guy is the opposite of what the next guy said. And, you know, and then it's like, well, but the guy who wrote it didn't even know that there's going to be a next guy. So like, you know, what am I really learning here? So I remember asking who I consider my mentor, who's Frank van Den in Belgium, asking him like, so what like about history in particular? It's like, what should I read, you know, for the history of this period? And he was kind of like, it was sweet. Like he was just kind of saying like, you just got to read a lot, you know, there is no shortcut. It's really like you as you read, you develop your compass for what is a good book and what is not, you know, what is, because once you see some gold nuggets, then you raise the bar and it's like, oh, all of a sudden now this is what I expect from a summary or from a historian or this or that. So it's kind of like, to me, it's about trusting your gut and really and being irreverent. You know, going to the source material. But one of the things that even only recently I was like, damn, like why didn't I pay more attention to this? Is the quality of the translation. Like if you're going to read a book, read the classics, the Greeks, it matters a huge amount who is translating it. Really, it's like not night and day, but it's like very significant differences. And like for Aristotle, for example, I'm just sticking with one. I stick with Joe Sachs. I love him. I love his approach, his take on things, his introductions. And so I don't know if I'll keep on doing that, but so I don't know. Like those are kind of my, and it's basically why I wanted to talk about this is like, I think it's so important to like make this stuff less intimidating. Because to me, it was a barrier. It was like, oh, but there's only one way, you know, you need to go to university and listen to this. What if he's boring, you know, whoever professor is teaching that course, you know, it's too bad if he would ruin the whole subject for you.
Absolutely.
I'm curious. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll share some stuff back, but I'd like to ask you first, do you try to read a certain amount per day or per week? Do you set aside a certain time of day that you do your reading, or is it just on instinct or something like that?
It's something I want to like build it as my life gets more stable. I want that more. There are periods in my life where I wouldn't read any books, like long periods, just mostly because I was working through, you know, trauma stuff or therapy stuff. And it's just like my life is just all about emotional work here and now. And or like you're building a business, you know, and it's just like, there's just no, which I don't think has to be true, you know, there's no time, you know, but
right.
And so I guess the short answer is no. I try to sense if there are times when I'm feeling it, and then I just, you know, I'm in it for 8 hours a day, just nonstop reading, researching, writing. And then there's other periods where it's more like, you know, take off the pressure and it's about recharging and more, and also like orientation, like what do I want to do next? So I feel like if you're reading to just tick off like, oh, here's another title, here's another one that I read. And it's like, okay, but what do you want to do? Like, that's not going to be in a book. Like, what do you want to know? You know, what do you care about? You know, to me, so that's why I try to really be okay with not beating myself over the head if I'm not reading enough or being very disciplined about it. But eventually I do want to get there because I think there is a lot of power in habit and in consistency. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. To respond to that particular point, I've had periods in my life where I was very regimented about it. Much more so before having my daughter. Life was a little simpler back then as far as schedule and all of that. But now I think the one consistent thing I do is I read every night in bed. I have a Kindle so I can lay there and read in bed. I do that basically every night. And it, you know, helps me fall asleep, and clearly I enjoy it. But I, like you, I have this goal of getting to, if I'm ever going to read this Western canon thing, it's like I said, I think it's 2 hours of reading per day for 5 years. Like, that's no joke. You have to actually carve out some time and do that. Trying to get more stability in my life to do that. And to your point, it's not like I don't have the time. It's a matter of prioritization. I am kind of building a business right now. I'm also being a dad to a young daughter and all of that. So it's complicated, to say the least. But a couple of things that have helped me with this approach to this, I guess this is an approach to reading and studying in general, but a lot of that is in the domain of philosophy for me, because that's where my interest is. But and I think I got this, I was inspired by Naval, actually. I always had this tendency to want to read far and wide and read a lot of books at once, but I had some conditioning from my youth, I guess school maybe, that I should really like finish what you start, like open a book, finish a book, open a book, finish a book, resist that urge to read other things. And then, I don't know, Naval, whatever, a tweet or a podcast or something was like, no, read whatever you want, read far and wide. Taleb as well, Taleb's books. He's like, no, I have thousands of unread books, you know, read a little bit. Just to give yourself this freedom, like true freedom, to just like have a disciplined approach, but also don't be afraid to deviate from it and follow your interests or follow your intuition or whatever, you know. Don't be afraid to start in the middle of a book, skip around, you know, not finish the book, whatever. I think all that's very powerful. That also, that book that I mentioned, How to Read a Book, they talk about synoptic reading, which there's an approach. Basically, you're reading the table of contents, then you're reading the index, and then you're determining like, okay, how does this fit into what I'm doing right now? And then you can be a little more targeted in that book. You don't have to go cover to cover. Maybe you jump into 2 or 3 chapters and jump out.
So it's like look at the map before starting the journey, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Getting a lay of the land and then picking your spots, which is extremely powerful, because there's some books, you know, some books may be terrible in the first chapter or a few chapters and then have some real nuggets later on. Well, you might just miss that if you get ground out in the first few chapters.
Yeah, exactly.
Another thing that really helped me was speed reading. I just did this very simple course. I think it's on, if you Google Tim Ferriss speed reading course, it's like a free 30-minute course. You learn how to do it. It's really just about eye movement. I'm not going to say you leave the 30-minute course being able to speed read, but you get the basics. And then if you apply that and practice it for a number of months, you can get really good at it. And so now I have this skill. It's a tool, really. I can throttle up the speed at which I'm reading, or throttle down. If I'm reading something like Human Action by Mises, I have to throttle way down.
Yeah.
Because it's extremely dense.
Yeah, every sentence is like so dense, and
Yes. But then if you're reading a magazine or something, you can just fly through it. You know, you can read a page in 30 seconds or something.
The what you're talking about definitely resonates for me. Like, at any given time, there's like 20 books that I'm just in the process of reading. And I remember studying speed reading too at some point. And I think something about the attitude, I think, stuck with me, where it's like you kind of like shedding what's drilled into you that you gotta this is how to read, you know. It's like no, there's different ways, and depending on your need, you can kind of, like you say, throttle up or throttle down. One other thing that I found that I'm gravitating towards is I love secondhand bookstores way more than I do like just, I guess, regular bookstores, where it's like, oh, here's the latest, the New York Times bestseller list, like to the point where if there's a book that people on Twitter talk a lot about, I'm not gonna read it. Like, it's almost like, because I feel like that vibe, so that's already the zeitgeist. Yeah. And so it's like, is that really going to teach, which maybe that's pretentious or something, but like finding books that are kind of like forgotten, there's something about that really, it just, to me, it makes it like fresh or something. Or it's like, I also feel like I'm like a treasure hunter or something. Like I'm like finding something that is not on anybody's radar, including mine. And so maybe there's something really there, right? So that's been definitely a pattern for me, is like, just, I love those secondhand bookstores.
Yeah. I big time agree on the older books. Not only the classics, but even just old, like text, they're just older books that they seem to be, there's so much treasure, so many nuggets in there, right? That a lot of people don't know. Like Human Action's a great example. Human Action,
written in what, 50s, written in the early 60s, I think. And it was actually, his, him just rewriting what he already wrote in German 20 years before.
Right. The original was in 49, I think, and then he rewrote it for English.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably, of course, he probably would disagree that it's just a rewrite, but because after 20 years, but still, and it was his, English was like his fourth language or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, it must have been this Herculean effort in his 60s to write that.
Yeah, and you can tell when you read the book, it's very Germanic. And the way he handles
so many
English,
neologisms, like what's that word?
Yeah, but it's so damn good. It's really incredible. And he does not parse words. There's no wasted words. I don't think there are any wasted words in that book.
Well, his brother is a mathematician. Maybe that, is something that was in the family of like, don't waste people's time. Get to the point.
Yeah. And he's an economist, so he can't be wasting people's time.
Well, some do.
Yeah, well, modern, that's all they do, right? But I don't know. I've developed quite the affinity for older books. And this is probably something I also picked up from Taleb. He goes through, I read all his 5 books. I read Antifragile twice, but he mentions a lot of the authors that he reads and their classics. And
right.
Well, don't be afraid. I think there's more value there going into the past than it is trying to stick to books that are presently published. I found a lot more value going into the past.
Yeah, and I was just going to add something for me too, is like for me to realize that like my book collection it's like optionality. Like that's what I'm buying. If I buy a book, it's the option to read it at any time if I'm doing research. Because like there was a golden age where Google scanned like almost everything, including newspapers, but that's gone. You can't just find things online oftentimes, and just to have it in your home, knowing like, oh, I have like, I don't know, 10 books about the history of this. Like, let's have a look. That to me is the value of a book collection, rather than feeling bad, like, oh, like all these books I'm never going to be able to read.
Right. Yeah. It's like, just like the sats you're stacking, you're probably not going to spend them all over, but
yeah, good point.
Good to have that wealth. Right. One other thing I'd add here is just a general approach to studying our philosophies. I think the thinking is a big deal, right? And we probably just do this second nature. I think I've always been a bit of a thinker myself. That's probably what predisposes people towards this path in the first place, being curious or thinking a lot. But I found that, and this is thanks to my daughter, thanks to my girlfriend, like the idea of talking through what you're thinking about. Like my girlfriend does a really good job of pulling it out of me. She's like, oh, what are you talking about? What are you thinking about? What are you working on? That's a whole nother ball game, because you now have to you can understand it one way. You might have a good visual or intuitive grasp of it, but to then try to transform that into a coherent articulation that someone foreign to the concepts can digest. That's like a whole nother art form in and of itself.
Yeah, it's really hard.
But there's a refinement, and there's like, once you can do that, or maybe in that process, you might discover a new nugget that then feeds back into your own mental model.
Right.
And so this idea of like reading, writing, and then talking about it creates this crystallized understanding of things that I think is just unrivaled.
Yeah. It's like you're hardening it or something like that, or you're like developing it in a way that you couldn't if you're just thinking. Also, I remember being surprised, like Mises wrote somewhere, like if if you want to learn something about a subject, like, write a book about it. It's like so casual. It's just like, just write a book about it, you know?
Yeah.
So, I mean, and you can, doesn't have to be a book, but, you know, you can like just write drafts. And sometimes I have like 5 different drafts over the years, and then, and it all adds to, you know, my own understanding of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say for me personally, I don't know about you, but writing is extremely difficult. Just it doesn't ever seem to get easier, really.
I hate it. Yeah, I really do.
Yeah.
Although there is some moments sometimes when it's like I'm ready, and it just
Falls out.
all comes out, and that is really satisfying when it's almost like you've been constipated, and then like finally, you know, it's like relief. Like, yes.
Yeah, it's exactly like that. But you almost, I mean, there's no laxative for it, really. It just happens sometimes,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, you gotta, although, yeah, I'm trying to learn. I do think there is something like the same. We're talking, I think Hayek had a thing where I guess as you age, you just want to have the habits more. And so he would just write for 2 hours every day or something, which to me is like, but maybe once you're 70 or 60, it's like, yes, there's a lot there that you can just, you know, write down.
Right.
But still, for me, it's like I don't know. It's hard for me to get to the point where I feel like I really have something to say to write down.
Yeah. How do you, so on the topic of writing, I try to do this. I don't do this perfectly at all, but to just write when I'm writing, to like get out this really rough draft of whatever. I'll also outline a little bit. I may outline and write at the same time, so I have some structural idea of what I'm writing. But it's a really messy process. It's a disaster. It's the worst part of writing because it just feels like a mess.
Yeah.
Then I try to edit and refine, and I do a lot of that. And in the final stages of edit and refining, I'm actually reading it out loud to myself. Something I learned from Peterson is like it's one thing to read it quietly to yourself and edit.
Yeah.
It's a whole nother thing to read it out loud.
Yeah.
And then I publish. Do you have an approach to writing?
It's similar. Yeah, I would say it's similar. I got me this this like old fashioned, well, it's a modern product, but basically it's an old fashioned typewriter. That's the idea, where there's no internet on it, there's no nothing. You just type, and you can send it to yourself in an email, and that's it. And so that then you have that distraction free, just, you know, dumping the draft, and there's not even a cursor. There's a little screen, but there's not even a cursor to go up in the text. Just funny. So if you're not satisfied with the paragraph, you either have to delete all of it with the backspace, or you just rewrite it underneath it. So that I'm like discovering more and more, like there's power in like very limited workspaces, you know. I used to think like, oh, I just need one laptop and that's it. I can do anything. But there's sometimes power or I do a lot on paper, you know. I have like outlines and notes, and I might hang it on the wall for just kind of like, you know, passing by and thinking about it more. But yeah, the reading aloud definitely. It started when I was like preparing for presentations and stuff. I'd be like read aloud to myself, but I find that the best prose or whatever, the best writing comes out quite beautifully in spoken word. Like it can be, you know, there's something there. And when something doesn't sound right, it's probably not going to be very pleasant to read either.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah, agreed on that.
So I always read my tweets out. I don't. That's an exception. Like tweets are like, they're like the early. I should maybe be more careful with my tweets, but I'm pretty quick to just hit publish.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the incentive scheme over there in Twitterverse. So this is an interesting topic, and the question is, what is philosophy of law? How is it different from economics? One of my light bulb moments in a recent conversation with Stefan Kinsella, who I'm sure you're familiar with.
Oh yeah.
You know, I always knew this old adage that possession is 9/10 of the law. But he made the point that really the rule of law exists in its entirety to resolve conflict, obviously, but conflict is always over scarce resources of some kind by definition. So the rule of law grounds out in property. Ultimately, the rule of law exists to serve property disputes over property and resources. So, I don't know. That's just something I've been thinking about. Not really a question, but how do you define the philosophy of law?
Oh, I wish I had prepared a definition, but like to me, I think it's still broader. I think I disagree with Kinsella, and it's actually interesting that he actually clashed with Frank van Dun, back in the 90s and 2000s, because he's very anti-intellectual property, like he doesn't believe in it. And then van Dun has some articles where he points out some things that show that things are not that obvious. For example, what if I write an intimate love letter to my beloved, and then you intercept that and you copy it and you spread it all over the internet, and then you allow the physical letter to continue? Is that, oh, you didn't violate my property, So it's like supposedly everything's fine. Or you can go really quite extreme. You can be like, well, I own my hand, I own my finger, I own my gun, and so I should be allowed to squeeze that trigger whenever I want, and then or encirclement, that's another one. It's like, what if I buy land around somebody's property and I encircle them, and then I say, sorry, you can't access your land because it's my property. And then you could say technically, well, that's a dispute about property, but it's still, it's almost like a meta, no, you're talking about rights that go beyond, because if it was purely about that, maybe Walter Block would say, well, the guy has to get a helicopter and, land on his own property that way, but it's like, that's not, if you look at how law has evolved over, and existed, that doesn't seem like the best. So anyway, so to go back to like, what is philosophy of law? I think ultimately it's about how can humans live together how can we have order in society in a way that does not undermine or fundamentally violate the fact that we are individual autonomous human beings, because it's easy to come up with schemes that create order, but it's very hard to create schemes that create order and allow for individual liberty, like self-actualization, those kind of things. And so that to me is like what philosophy is about. Is like, what are the different modes of conflict resolution that exist, and then can we say something reasonable about when to apply which? You might be even going into law already once you start thinking about applying, and so out of philosophy of law comes political philosophy. It's like, because political philosophy is all about how to organize society. What is most important? Is property right more important, or is equality more important, or income? Unity, those kind of things. So that's kind of a very, I don't know how understandable of a take it is, but I would say, yeah, look, the challenge of creating order in society while still respecting individual rights, that is the task of philosophy of law. And that's very different from economics. And I think there's a lot of economists who think, oh, we don't need all that philosophy. We can just think about, what is the most efficient way to do things? But that's utilitarianism. It's like the greatest, whatever, happiness, the greatest wealth for the most amount of people. Well, that means you've already chosen a track within the umbrella of philosophy of law. So you're basically cheating, right? You're just saying you already chose it, and then you're saying, let's not talk about it anymore. It's like, no, let's open the discussion. We need to talk about this first before you economists can give us all your recommendations.
Interesting. This is probably a good place to start going into property a little bit. So I guess the first thing I would say is there seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong here, but so people acting in the world, there's always more want than there is ability to satisfy that want. As I've described, like the human heart is basically insatiable, right? No matter what you give us, we always want more. Like that's just how it is. So to resolve then this limitless demand over limited supply, right? We have to allocate the supply. We can do that. I think there's only one of two ways, really. It's like by contract, which is two parties mutually agreeing to, exchange something, exchange property, or conflict. And conflict is just, it's force, right? To go and take someone's property or whatever. But the paradox here perhaps is that contract itself, like a contract's really only enforceable in the shadow of the law. Right? Like you and I can agree to a certain contract to exchange two types or two certain forms of property. But if one of us, doesn't fulfill the conditions of the contract, then the other counterparty to the contract needs recourse to some form of force or coercion, right, to enforce compliance with the mutually agreed upon terms of the contract. So I get stuck in this when I try to think about this. It's like, okay, we could do it all by contract. We wouldn't need any conflict, but you need the conflict to enforce the contract, at least the threat of conflict to enforce the contract.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting into, head to head about yesterday on Twitter, where it was the words were different, but I think it's the same issue, which is like justice versus war. Do we need war to enforce just society? And that's almost the paradox. It's like, well, but So I appreciate that. I think what you're presenting is like a paradox. Do you agree or no?
I think so. I mean, my current thinking on it, yeah. And it gets a little bit different with things like Bitcoin, because presumably that's sort of a self-enforcing contract in a way. It's like, it's just possession of the Bitcoin. There's nothing else to fight over. It's like, do you have it or not?
I would suggest let's go in
other property rights. Clearly,
I didn't hear it. Sorry.
I was just saying that that would be specific to Bitcoin. We would still have this paradox with all other property relationships between owners and tangible forms.
Well, and even in Bitcoin, there can be all kinds of ways that people lose control of their Bitcoin, or there's all kinds of conflicts possible. But I would suggest we park the paradox and we go into the causes of conflict and the universal solutions to conflict, and then we return to the paradox and see if we get some more clarity on that.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay, well, so I'm excited because this is something that I learned from Van Dam. He's just to give a bit more context to him as a person. Philosopher of law. He discovered, I want to say, argumentation ethics, or rediscovered it, or really refined it, because there are some traces of it throughout history. But in the early 80s, he developed argumentation ethics, which is basically a foundation for property rights, like a philosophical foundation for property rights. Because that's always the question. It's like, why would do I need to respect the fact that you own this land? Where does that come from? So it's been, especially among libertarians, it's one of the hot button issues, because we need to justify that we believe in this stuff. It's not just arbitrary. And so he came up with it in the early 80s, and then Hoppe, I think independently, also came up with it 5-ish years later, in the early 90s, I think. And then often Hans Hoppe, his famous book is Democracy, the God That Failed, Austrian economist from, I think he's from Germany, right? I'm not sure. I think he's German.
I think so. That book is excellent. Democracy, the God That Failed. Jimmy Song and I did a series on it. Yeah.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, so Hans Hoppe popularized it, and now is often credited with, argumentation ethics, but it actually goes back to Van Dun. And he wrote his treatise as The Fundamental Principle of Law, which is too bad it's only in Dutch available, but it's phenomenal. And eventually we'll probably translate it to English. So, but we would organize seminars with him, and it was just amazing to learn from him. And he did join a lot of Austrian conferences over the years, and it's funny because he basically was reading scholastic literature, all kinds of stuff, and became Mises style, classical liberal, even Rothbard style anarcho-capitalist, and then eventually discovered that there's a whole literature about that, and he finally knew how to call himself. But so as a philosopher of law, he was just kept thinking about, okay, well, we want to resolve conflict. Well, what are the universal causes of conflict? What causes conflict in general? And so he came up, and I haven't been able to break it. I think it's rock solid that there are 4 necessary causes for any kind of conflict ever. And I think we can best explain it with an example. So we just need to find something that's desirable. I don't know, maybe like a steak or something. Does that sound good? Or pancakes, or I don't know. Yeah, let's do steak. All right. So let's say steak. Okay. So what do we need to have a conflict? First of all, we need to have more than one person. I know that sounds very like basic, but it's like, if you have unity, if there is only one being, then there is nothing to have a conflict about. So you need plurality. So you and I. Okay, so we have 2 persons. All right, that's the first building block for a conflict. We're going to need four boxes to tick. So 2 people. All right, and then we need to have freedom of access. Let's take that freedom of access. So we need to have access to the thing that we desire. Because if you and I live in North Korea, we can like fantasize all day long about filet mignon and this and that. It doesn't matter. It could be on the moon, right? We're not going to have an actual conflict about this. But if we're in the same room and there's a juicy steak there, we might have a fight over it. So that's the other thing. It's like freedom of access, and then you kind of feel where Bitcoin is. That's where Bitcoin shines, because you can regulate that access really well. And then what we also need is diversity of opinion. Because if I want the steak and you want for me to have the steak, there's no conflict. If there's consensus, there's no conflict. And then finally, what we also need is scarcity. Because if there's like 40 steaks in the room and they're all equally good, well, we're not going to have a conflict today. Maybe eventually, but not today. So if there's abundance, there's not going to be a conflict. So we need to tick all the boxes. We need plurality, we need diversity of opinion, we need freedom of access, and we need scarcity. And so then by starting there, then you can go to, okay, well, what are the universal solutions to conflict? It's basically you take away one. That's all you need. So if we can take away if we can take away plurality, meaning we take away the fact that we are multiple individuals with our own wills and our own autonomy, well, then that's kind of amazing. We have peace. And I think, and that's what Van Dun argues, like that's kind of the philosophy of communism. That's where, you get this, I was reading this book, it's quite amazing. It's Architecture of the Stalin Era, right? And so it goes into just the kind of thinking that went into and most of this stuff was never built, which is kind of, it kind of shows how dysfunctional it is, because it's an illusion, right? You cannot think away plurality, but they were trying. And what you can end up with is this larger than life, like these monumental things that strip away all humanity, and they're like anthills. Like if you think about these structures, like there's just like big blobs that are way too big, and it doesn't work. But if everyone tries to believe it, you can kind of weirdly make it work for a while. So anyway, that's kind of like unity. That's the political. There's a lot of other ways to look at unity, but from a political point of view, it would be like pretty much communism.
Yeah.
And then you can go to, the next way to solve conflicts would be to restrict access. So instead of freedom of access, you can restrict access. And that's where technology has been amazing, right? Because having a lock on your door, having a lock on your car, having cryptography, all those things allow us, and also even in nature, right? If you think about, you go from these, whatever they're called, like protozoa, or like just single cell organisms, to like something that lives in the ocean and actually has a hard shell. Well, that is restriction of access, right? A turtle, right? You protect yourself against the environment. So of course it's related to property rights, but it's kind of more primitive than that. It's more of a mechanical way to restrict access. I would say property rights is actually a level higher still. But that's one way, restriction of access. I can be like, look, well, I don't know what I do with the steak, Tim. I don't know. I basically I could have the knife, right? And I could say, look, I'm gonna pinch you if you try and get this. So I'm restricting your ability to access the steak. So I could do something like that, like self-defense kind of thing. And then the next universal solution is consensus, where it's like, okay, let's agree we are different people. We do have access to the same thing. The steak is in the room. It's scarce. There's only one. But what if we can kind of work out a system where we somehow still agree? Maybe I have a steak today and you have one tomorrow, and we do it that way. So that's where you get these negotiations. That's where, like in the most primitive form, it's probably like kind of like a tribal environment where people start to like be like, okay, well, you get these roles. Like, how about I'm the magician guy, and you can be the lumberjack, and and he can be the tribesman, and whatever. And then people feel safe with that. Like there's a kind of there's a big cultural element where it's like, okay, like unity to me is about unconscious programming, whereas consensus is about conscious. Like we acknowledge we're separate people, but we're consciously programming ourselves to agree with each other. And that's why, of course, when society changes a lot, well, the consensus gets all wobbly because it was an operating system for a reality that doesn't exist anymore. So you get all kinds of conflicts. And just to not dwell too long, but then the final solution to conflict is abundance, right? As you take away the scarcity. And of course you can either create abundance, which is a lot of the American dream is about that. You start from the bootstraps, you build a company, your widget is better than cheaper than the other. It's true. It creates peace. If there's wealth, abundance, it is much less likely for conflict to happen in that environment. And then there's also the ideological version of it, which is let's just vote for abundance. Let's just try and will it into existence. That's like the fiat, what you're talking about. Like, let's just declare there is abundance, minimum wage, I don't know, like a social support net, free healthcare, free this, free that. Like that is the ideology of abundance. And so with those four universal solutions, you can start thinking about even like categorizing some political factions like today. Like you could think about, well, generally the left, what you could generally call the left, I think is probably more sympathetic towards abundance, this idea of like voting for abundance. And on a personal level, they can be in favor of restriction of access. Sometimes they kind of like the personal freedom to do, in my home, I do what I want. I can dye my hair purple, that tends to be more the left. And then I think rather, this is all very, cliche and there's many variations, but maybe the right is more, I guess, it could be abundance through entrepreneurship. The left tends to be more also about consensus, social contracts, we get together. I remember I was in Oregon once and I and it was like there was nobody in sight, and we were in front of a red light, and I was like, why are you stopping? And this is like the early 2000s, like no cameras, no nothing. And the lady was like, well, because we decided this. And I was like, what are you talking about? It's like, well, we created this rule that says you have to stop for a red light. And so she was very much in that consensus mindset. Like, we all agree, and that's how. And so I don't know, I'm curious about your thoughts, but I think the right is more about, on the one hand, restriction of access property rights, but also there tends to be some unity a bit more, like, why can't we all just do what we're told? And, you just got to know your place, or the kind of, the kind of thing where the left feels like, no, you guys are authoritarian. I think that's a bit more alive sometimes in the right. And so to me, like, this framework, I'm curious about your thought, but this framework, it like allows for a lot of compassion, that like we're all trying to solve conflict here, right? And we just have different ideas on how to do it. And it's, it to me, it humanizes the debate a lot, and it clarifies a lot. It makes it more, okay, what are the levers that we can tweak here?
Yes. No, wow, that's interesting. I've never heard of this framework before. But it's quite interesting. I guess, presumably the capitalist system or ideology is really just trying to resolve conflict with point number 4, right? Increasing economic abundance, but then also having strong rule of law, because there's still going to be I guess abundance never.
It's never enough.
You can never remove scarcity, as we said earlier.
Yeah.
That's kind of the punchline. So you could reduce.
And so in a way, you can validate the criticism of the left, right? If you describe capitalism as only creating more abundance, well, then they're right to be critical of that, right? But if you're saying, no, we have property rights, and like an emerging property of that is that eventually you get more abundance, well, that's a more subtle debate, I think.
Yeah, and that's what I would argue. You observe that historically, right? That's what the United States is the greatest experiment in strong property rights and capitalism. And here we are, right? The wealthiest generation there's ever been. So I get one thing that really jumps out to me, and I've been thinking about this recently, is I've started to look at that left-right dichotomy as maybe a bit false. I mean, I know it's real, and people have the individualist versus unity kind of ethic, but in reality, all we actually have are real individuals, right? This is the first axiom of economics: man must act. Then all the collectives we describe, the nation, the church, the Western world, the Eastern world, wherever you want to circumscribe a group of individuals and put a label on it, it's a fiction. It's a useful fiction, and we can. There's no exactness to it, right? There's never like, oh, these are the Democrats and those are the Republicans. Like, it's always a useful fiction, and those useful fictions are always comprised of real individuals. So the fundamental struggle that I think is real is this idea of the real individual versus the fictionalized collective.
Yep.
And you'll notice too, when you get, like the Marxist credo, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, there's always this appeal to the greater good, or this fictional subduing your own self-interest to serve the greater interest of the greater good of society. Right? They're always like, sacrifice the real individual and give to this fictional collective. And
that's where it gets dangerous, right? If you like, that's what you get in the exponent of that is Stalinism. Like, that's the ultimate, and so you're right. Groupthink, that's the direction that it goes. Every time you deny the existence of the individual, or that the individual has to, although I do think, like Walter Block and stuff, there are libertarians, I think, who cross the line where they're like, oh, the individual above all else. I do think there's, to me, it's reason above all else, like that, it's like, it's the dialogue above all else, not like whatever I think I need above all else. Like that gets, well, then you just have war, right?
Yes. And I should say here, I'm not trying to throw out useful fictions and say, oh, those are just, that's why I call them useful fictions. Like, we need useful fictions. That's actually what makes human beings so powerful, is that we can create these abstractions and orient ourselves under them, right? This is the whole Yuval Harari thesis in Sapiens, that man can cooperate flexibly in large numbers the way no other animal can, because we have things like nation states and money and human rights. Like, we can
Yeah, we
create an
can program
idea or
ourselves,
principle.
right? I mean, like we rewrite our own software.
Absolutely. And that's where it gets interesting, because it's almost like if you're appealing to a group of individuals to sacrifice their individual self-interest and serve the communal, that is necessarily being espoused by an individual serving their own self-interest, right? They might say,
it's like the priest speaking for God. It's like, yeah, but dude, but you're human, you know?
Right, exactly. So it's like, no matter what that usually guy, but I guess it could also be a girl, says, it's like you can't trust it, right? Because they're talking about serving some fictionalized collective.
Right.
They're trying. What my instinct is, it's almost like preying on the compassion circuitry that we all have. Like, people come hardwired with this communal instinct, right? We're communal animals, we're social creatures. And I always go back to the Marxist thing, like, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. That sounds beautiful. Like, great. Can't we just do that? And the whole world would be harmonious, and, everyone's bellies would be filled, and et cetera. But what actually happens when you implement that? The exact opposite, right? Like, hundreds, millions starved, millions murdered, totalitarianism, all the atrocities of human history. So there's this key point that compassion doesn't scale.
I was just about to say, like, it's like with everything, is like distance is so important, like when I read this thing in a book about beauty. It's like, well, beauty depends on how far you are of the thing that you're looking at. Like, a fire can be beautiful, not if you're standing inside of it,
right?
Not if it's your house burning down around you, So like the whole empathy circuitry is so powerful, so important. But it's for personal relationships. If we're thinking about thousands or millions of people, that circuitry can be deceiving to us. And I think often we need to, I mean, it's that's why Bitcoin is going to win, because it has the most, what is the word? The most lightweight core protocol, And so to me, it's like, I do think there is a hierarchy to these elements of unity, access, restriction. I think unity is the bottom layer, because I mean, ultimately in the cosmos, like, everything is connected. So you could say there is a unity already, right? But when you're thinking about, like, human society, well, what kind of unconscious programming do we all need to make this work on a larger scale? Well, that's very minimal. Like, we don't need to agree on a lot of things. Maybe it's something to do with some form of language. Like, if we can kind of learn some form of language, if we can kind of be aware of our individuality, that's all very minimal, but because those are things that you learn as an infant before you can talk, by being your body is respected, the kind of the things that you do to a toddler. Like, you can't get them to agree with how you're raising them, because they can't even talk yet. So in a way, you are unconscious. Whatever you do is unconsciously programming them. You're the role model. And so, yeah, it's like that layer of unity. Sure, there's a place for it, but it probably should be quite small. And then as we grow up, we should be able to be aware of it and tweak it as, however we need it for our lives, or for, I don't know, not for society, for us individually.
Right. Yeah. There's, maybe the Dunbar number of 150 people. There's like, there's some degree of compassion there. But then as you move in concentric circles, like, say, from the 150 people closest to you to the 45 people closest to you, there's more compassion there, maybe in your church or whatever. And then you get down to the 15 people closest to you, friends and family, there's more compassion there.
Yeah.
And then down to the 3, like your core family unit, there's maximum compassion, right? Total communism.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not billing my
Yeah.
daughter for breakfast. I'm just giving the shirt off my back, so to speak.
Right.
And that's one of Taleb's points. He calls it the scale variance of your political ideology, where he says, I'm a communist at the family scale, but I'm a total capitalist at the geopolitical scale.
Yeah. And the people who like are on a soapbox talking about we need compassion, and those are often the people with the most dysfunctional family backgrounds, right? They're often the ones who fail at, living compassion in their very personal relationships.
Yes. And you hit the nail on the head for me when you said self-programming, because that seems to be key here too. It's that the understanding that we're all running software and that we all can be programmed. If you understand that, then you're probably going to try to program yourself as best that you can. Put yourself around the right people, read the right books, travel, like live healthy, whatever. You'll adopt better habits. If you don't understand that, then someone else is likely to prey on that. They're going to program.
It's like you're giving them the keys, right? Yeah, you're like, go ahead.
Yeah, so it gets a little bit almost metaphysical here, because again, we're living in these useful fictions, right? We're all inhabiting this story of whatever it is. We're Americans, for instance. We're Bitcoiners, I guess you could say more loosely. We're entrepreneurs, whatever. It's a story.
Yep.
And when you're inhabiting that story, you're kind of in a trance of some kind. And like, this sounds a little bit crazy until you see a bunch of people walk into a movie theater, for instance. Everyone just buys their ticket. They sit in the theater. You've got your back to strangers. You don't know any of these people. Like, how do you trust them? And everyone's quiet during the movie. Like, we're embodying the ethos of this story or something. And it allows us to collaborate with strangers, right? Which is a really, if you like really stop to think about it, and you go out into the city, you're just around all these people.
Yep.
Rewind that a couple of thousand years, I don't think that really would have worked so well, right? We didn't have the protocols or private property rights or whatever it is that allows us to have discourse in a harmonious way.
Right.
It's all a software. There's a cultural software, and then there's the individual software, and they're interfacing with one another.
Right.
So yeah, just a strange way to think about it then. And then I guess when you see people like largely politicians, typically, they're trying to prey on it seems like they're trying to prey on people's emotions. And if you can keep people in an emotional state, they'll never think. They'll never realize they can program themselves or be free or think critically or question the illusions or question the useful fiction. Right. They'll just like operate out of fear. So that's where Fiat comes into play. And
and I think it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but I think often probably the people you're talking about, the individuals, like they have a fear to let go of the stories that they have, and so they basically are trying to create consensus. Like, what if I can make everyone believe the same story? And so I'm just going to talk about it like it's reality. Like, of course, evil corporations are creating inflation, and then other people can deal with the weirdness that you're just making shit up and it doesn't make sense, like you just outsource it in a way. But it doesn't really matter what goes on for those people and like those politicians. It's true, like, it is predatory, and you're messing with how people are wired and their emotional circuitry.
Yeah. And one last, so again, thinking about Fiat a lot, I've been trying to understand, like, where does it's almost an evil impulse in a way, but also not. And here's why. I was, again, raising a young daughter. I raised my daughter by Fiat.
Mm-hmm.
She's 3 years old. She doesn't know what's good and what's bad. And she don't run down the stairs, don't swallow the marble, all the things that can really hurt her.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, no, don't do that because I said so.
Yeah.
I can tell her why, but ultimately it's an authoritarian approach, right? And you have to do that with your kids.
Yeah, you need to program them.
You also want to phase out of it over time.
Yeah,
you don't want to be telling your 30-year-old not to swallow the marble and not to run up the stairs. Like, you're doing it with the intention of grooming them for autonomy. But it seems like there's some weird schism, some psychological schism on humanity where like adults grow up and they feel like they still need to do this to other adults. And I don't know, like it's an immaturity on both sides. It's an immaturity to be coerced by fiat, but I think it's also an immaturity to try and coerce adults by fiat. I understand.
Yeah, no,
like,
I agree, and I think both of them. Maybe I'm wrong, but I would say at the root it's a lack of awareness. Like it's a lack of awareness of your own autonomy and of other people's responsibility. Like other people are responsible for their own lives. You're responsible for your life. And if you really accept that, then a lot of this, all the mirage we're talking about, it falls away and things become very simple. And then of course there's conventions, but you can see them as such. It's like, yeah, we're all quiet in the theater because it works, you know, that's just how it works. And not because it's the unchangeable reality, you know, like, no, we can change all that. It's just a convention and it works. And this is how we do it in this culture. But ultimately, yeah, like that awareness that we are responsible for our own lives. I think it can be severely damaged by how you're raised as a kid. You know, if you can never question anything, if you can never talk back, if you're shamed and punished a lot, I think that you know, and even neglect, right? I mean, if you look at feral children, like I remember I don't know why in my early 20s, I was like really fascinated by this phenomenon of like children that are abandoned at a very early age. They cannot get to the level of a normal adult anymore, and they have a severe lack in self-awareness, you know. So it's like by interacting with other people, we learn about ourselves a lot. So yeah, there's so many elements that go into. It's like we often take for granted, like, oh, we are all humans, but it's like no. If you look at a child without a certain context, this is not going to turn into a full human being. It won't.
Right. Yes.
It's kind of, I don't know. It's beautiful and terrifying, you know, that it's not a given that a child will turn into a real adult, you know, in the philosophical sense.
Yes. Yeah. It's and there's something about, like you just described, the division of it, right? If you separate a child from, actually, I read this recently. There are record levels of speech development impediments as a result of the mask mandate.
The pandemic, yeah. The masking.
Because kids are not getting the nonverbal cues of how to learn how to speak because everyone's always wearing these masks.
Yep.
And it's like, there it is. That's a division, right? You're creating some barrier to the flow of information, I guess. And there seems to be like a similar dynamic when you're creating barriers to the flow of, I mean, a lot of things, goods, services, people, information, when we draw these arbitrary constructions, like even nations, right?
Yeah, you mean like almost like a taboo culture. It's like, that's off limits. You can't do this.
Well, I'm
you
just
can't do that.
like you said earlier, where if you don't understand that we're creating these useful fictions and they can be modified, then you just take them to be ever present and eternal, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm American and it's the dollar, the end. You never think about it again. And if you get trapped in that, you're toast. You're someone else's pawn.
You're like an accident waiting to happen. You know, eventually you're going to self-emulate. Like when reality hits you, and I've seen people like that. They live in a bubble, and eventually a reality hits them like a truck, and then they're done. It's over. Their life is over.
Yeah, and that's what I mentioned to you offline. Like, I've lost a lot of faith recently in humans. Like, a lot of those people have just fallen in line with whatever narrative is being fed to them. That just, okay, yes, give me another booster, give me another mask, I'll stay at home, I trust my government. And it's like, I'm not here to tell you what to think necessarily, but I would encourage you to ask questions about your reality in the interest of being a self-responsible, autonomous human, which you ultimately are.
Yeah.
Like, you can't get rid of that reality. You can't wish it away. You can't outsource it. You're ultimately always responsible for yourself. And it's just disturbing to see people not operate from that level, I guess.
There might be a silver lining to all this for the young generation, because you could argue that more than we were able to growing up, the young generation now is going to see roughly two categories of adults. Like they're going to see people that melt down, panic, like go into rages, all that stuff. And they're going to see people that show courage and curiosity and resourcefulness in the face of adversity. And that'll, I think it'll make it more clear, you know, that there are two paths, roughly speaking, in life, that you can go to, you know, more humanity, or you can kind of, what is it? In these old books, you read them, they write about, like, you know, genius and then Philistine, like you know, the opposite of genius and humanity is like, you know, the brute, you know, the primitive, the Philistines. Which maybe it's not politically. I don't even know if what we're supposed to say.
Can we say it's like fear versus love in the old spiritual? It's like if you're.
I don't know. Again, I guess I don't know enough about the context, because there's so many contexts that those words are used in.
I'm just saying if fiat is indeed, and this is all just speculation, I don't have anything to back this up really, but I just, fiat appears to me to be a product of fear. Whether you're imposing fiat, you're scared what people would do otherwise, so you're trying to force them to do something. And if you're complying to fiat, well, you're scared of what the fiat-tongued perpetrator might do to you if you don't listen to them.
Yeah.
Whereas love is something more, I mean, love's a whole deep, complicated word, but in many spiritual books I read, it's like you have to decide, are you acting out of fear, or are you acting out of love?
I see.
There's not really a lot of middle ground there. So I guess love would just be not acting out of fear.
Off the top of my head, if it said irrational fear and then, you know, rational love, I would sign that. Like, because I do think love can, you know, you can get into like fawn, you know, like that's not, I don't, yeah, of course, then it's like, oh, but that's not love. But it's like, well, you know, if love is congruent with reality, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I'll unpack love a little bit. The Greeks had a lot of words for love. I know of three pretty closely. There's eros, which is consumptive love. I love the steak. I want to eat the steak, right? There's philia, which is reciprocal love, friendship, romantic relationship. You don't want to eat your friends. You want ongoing reciprocal interaction with them. That's the value. And then agape, which is very central to the Judeo-Christian tradition, the selfless love of a parent for a child, right? When your child first comes home from the hospital, they're just inert. Really, there's not even reciprocal love. I mean, there is some degree of it, I guess, but not much. Yeah. You're just giving to this child. So I guess maybe it's the middle one there, right? If we just get more philia in society, that's just, again, in the Austrian tradition, mutual voluntary exchange, kind of a form of philia. I want to have ongoing trading relationship with you. It doesn't mean I love you, like hug you, kiss you, but I want an ongoing relationship. I don't want to consume you.
Yeah. And then you want that with reality too, right? I mean, you know, reality gives back as you give attention to it. Yes. It gives you back, and then you live in reality. You know, yeah, I can see that. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever read the book Finite and Infinite Games?
I have not. No.
It's an interesting little philosophy book. It's kind of along the same lines as like a finite game you play to win, and an infinite game you play to keep playing. So it seems like the more we could get to the latter, the better.
Oh yeah, it's also a bit like that. You know, it's not about the destination; it's about the journey.
Right. Exactly.
Hey everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's another one of those areas like property, which I want to talk more about now, but so sorely misunderstood. Fiat's even worse because you say the word fiat, people are like, the car? They have no idea. Even if you understand, even Bitcoiners that understand fiat currency and fiat money, they don't understand legislation by fiat, right? Fiat law versus, I guess, customary law or discovered law.
Well, I think it goes into lex versus use, right? Lex is like the rule, whereas use is like the law, which is natural law, which is like the process, the thing that you end up with, the conclusion you end up with after discourse.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people think that everything is about lex, it's just whoever's in charge, they're making the rules and that's it. But then of course it's like, well, are all laws just, can you have some laws that are just not right? Of course you can.
Yes, of course. Yeah. The more Cicero, the more laws, the less justice. That reminded me too. I mean, I really think fiat is, how do I say this? Very close to the heart of evil, right? The idea, and here's another way to put it. The original fiat was fiat lux. God said, let there be light. So it was a decree from a higher power that created reality. Fiat from man then is basically an attempt to play God, right? We're trying to make an assertion about reality override reality, an assertion about law overriding natural law, for instance.
Right.
That's inevitably doomed to fail. I can say by fiat, the sun will not rise tomorrow. I'm probably going to fail, right?
Yeah.
So
one of the things that Von Den always came back to was like, well, what if someone disagrees? Here's your amazing plan about how it all is going to work. And then like the way to stress test it is like, all right, well, what if somebody disagrees? What do you do? And that is the failure of fiat. It's like, oh, because I say so. It's like, really? Like, what if I disagree? What do we do?
Yeah, exactly. And you could take that, maybe you could add to that too, and Peterson made this point, that even if you could hypothetically construct the ultimate perfect communistic plan, right? Like we know everything to do, we know how to allocate every resource perfectly, everyone will be happy. Just assume we could do that somehow, which clearly is impossible, but even if we could, 1 second into that plan, reality would have changed, right? Reality's constantly changing. You can't have a final static plan for a continuously, never-endingly adaptive reality. It will never work.
Yeah.
You think you've mapped the territory perfectly, and then the territory shifts.
Yeah. Hence, socialism can't calculate.
Can't calculate, can't adapt, so it fails.
Yeah. But of course, under socialism, they'll say like, but who are you to say that you know the will of the nation? It's just so slippery, right? They just bury you in rhetoric.
The will of the nation, appealing straight to the collective, the fictionalized collective.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it becomes an excuse to murder real individuals. It's like, well, we did it for the good of the country. He was impeding the socialist utopia. So it's really bad. I want to ask about property, which we said we'd talk about a bit here. One of the things, let me just say a couple of things about property, and then I have a question I want to ask you about it. So the first thing that I've really tried to drive home in my work is that property is not a tangible thing, or even it's not the asset, whether tangible or intangible. Property is not the asset. Property is the bond or the relationship between an owner and asset. Now, I thought of this as something even deeper than law, almost as something that precedes law in a way. That if I'm a hunter and gatherer and I own a dagger, right? There's no legal system defending my rights to that dagger. It's like this is my property. In a biological term, it's an extended phenotype. It's a tool that I made or acquired, and I can defend it and I can use it. So it's my property. Now you could also look at that in the legal sense that there is then a rule of law that protects that relationship between owner and asset. So looking at property in the non-legal sense, I also think it is a product of freedom. And the way I look at this is in the natural law tradition, we have life, liberty, property. Life would be your future freedom. If you take someone's life, you've stolen their future. Basically, you kill them, they have no more future.
Yep.
Their liberty is your present freedom. If I throw you in jail or incarcerate you or otherwise restrict you, I've inhibited your ability to express your freedom in the present. And then if I steal your property, I've taken away the fruits of your past freedom. Whatever you've done in the past to create value or create something of use, that was itself a fruit of freedom, I guess, a fruit of your past freedom.
Yep.
So drilling into the past, and so property is a product of past freedom. And I get this from Rothbard, it's essentially an extension of individual self-ownership, right? So we are each our own most personal property. We're each individually self-owned. We can then choose to take that self-ownership into the world and create something of value, build a building, plant a garden, start a business, and then have rights to the fruit of that labor, essentially, that we can then trade. We can trade those fruits with other self-owned people. That's like the essence of capitalism and natural law. Here's my question. Something I took to be so obvious, which is individual self-ownership. I've had a lot of pushback on this from a lot of people. And they're like, no, you're not self-owned. You are the product of, the people you spend, of your community and your environment and your path-dependent life history and all of these things. Are we individually self-owned? And if we are, how do we prove that in an argumentatively sound way?
Yes. So before I try to answer that question, I just want to validate what you said before, that property is about the relation between you and an asset, and you and another, and a phenomenon, right? I mean, you could even put it that way, because it doesn't have to be tangible. And it's not about just the physical asset. I think that's really important. One word that Van Dun often used that really helps, drive the point, home or just illuminate all this is the concept of authorship. So that, you are the author of your life. You are the author. If you create this knife, you are the author of it. If you write a letter, you're the author of it. And so you just, of course, you extend yourself, you blend it in with the world, you extend it by your labor, and it becomes, like you say, it allows you to live a different future than you would if you didn't have those things, or if they're taken away from you. So people can steal your future from you. And to, maybe part of why there is so much confusion about this is that ever since the Enlightenment, there's been this enormously influential school of materialism, the billiard ball model, and, that whole idea that like everything is about the here and the now and the tangible. And what I think is often forgotten is what Aristotle, I actually forget his exact word, but the material cause of things, which is, I think he uses hyle, which is like wood, the wood that you make a statue of, but it's the inputs that make something possible in the future. It's the paint that the painter uses, he could make 1 million paintings out of this little palette of paint. And that is what property represents. It's, like we were talking about the library of books, like I don't have to use every book every day for it to still be part of myself. This is who I am as a writer. If my books were taken away from me, I would be a very different type of writer that would change my future. So just to validate that, So you were asking about, okay, what is the argument? And it's true, people really challenge you if you're like, hey, I'm a self-owner. Like, isn't that obvious? It's like, no, you're just biology. You're like, you're a product of your parents, and like, or even with the social contract. It's like, I never signed the social contract. So like, what is this thing about? So no, but your ancestors did. It's like, oh, really? And so, but it's so that's only for like that kind of stuff. But like, if my ancestor like took part in genocide, then I'm not guilty. Like, so
Right.
aren't those
Another
like
fictionalized collective, right?
Yeah,
The ancestors.
right.
Ooh, yeah.
So it's a very common, it's a common criticism, like, oh, are you really a self-owner? So this is, I think, where the argument from argumentation comes, really shines, and it's another, what is the official term for it? It's argumentation ethics. So the idea of argumentation ethics is that our essence of human being is that we are a conversational dialogue is just so central to who we are, and so if you choose to go in a dialogue with me, you are implicitly respecting an ethical framework that underlies that. You're implicitly acknowledging that I am a self-owner. You start talking to me. It's like, okay, well, if you ask me a question, in order to get an honest answer, you cannot threaten me with force. You have to respect that, you can't tower over me, all that stuff. And so that's the very beginning of like, and so it's self-refuting to talk to someone, to disagree with someone that they are self-owners, because in the very act of disagreeing, because we're both agreeing to disagree, I'm acknowledging that you're a self-owner. And so then if I'm like, yeah, well, whatever, I'm still going to threaten you with force, well, then it's like, okay, well, now we're no longer in a dialogue. You're behaving like an animal, so I can treat you like an animal, which is get away from me, I'm closing the door, whatever, self-defense. So it's kind of like, and it's not, it takes time to work with this stuff, to realize that it's not a little mind game to do this. It is a proof, which doesn't mean that, how do I say this? There's many ways to validate a certain reality, but this is one that is particularly simple, straightforward, easy to do, and it goes to the heart of this very core human activity of dialogue. So that's kind of one way to explain argumentation ethics. And of course, then it's also like, if I threaten you with theft, well, then again, I'm unlikely to get an honest answer from you, right? If it's like, oh, only, what do you think of this? And if you give me the wrong answer, I'm going to steal from you. Well, then that's, so again, that also validates that our property is an extension of our individual person.
That's super helpful, actually, because, okay, yeah, agreed on dialogue, first of all. And also, just small tangent, but I think that might be the great power of the digital age. Actually, what we're doing right now, just engaging in dialogos. Whereas in the 20th century, media there wasn't much dialogos going on. We had a little bit of talk radio that a few people listened to. Maybe you got some there, but most of it was, again, agenda, like talking at people, sound
one-way
bites.
programming.
Yes, exactly. So now we moved from the one-to-many models to the many-to-many dialogos.
Yeah.
And so in the digital age, maybe that's the great hope here, is we're having a resurgence in dialogue, and that will help the human collective to use a useful fiction.
You could even argue that there was a part of the printing press revolution that actually undermined a tradition of dialogue that did exist. For all the flaws that the scholastics had, their model of pushing knowledge forward was very much about debates. They had amazing kind of like a tradition of back and forth, and always acknowledging your opponent's arguments as you proceed. Like that was the basis of science. Like for all for all the gripes we have with the scholastics, they paved the way in many ways. And I think, and this is one of my, what do you call it, pet peeves, is that the Protestant Reformation with the printing press, there is something there that lay at the basis of the whole idea of schooling children, the way the educational system is built, the idea of didactics, the idea that you can print something on a page and you show it to 1,000 people and you imprint this image in their mind like a stamp on wax, or the idea of like tabula rasa, like literally a blank page. The human mind is like a blank page. We can write on it. There's a lot of hubris in that. And I think that part of the dysfunction that we have in our world today stems from that. It's kind of like that, the lost tradition of Socratic dialogue, of debate, of listening to someone, thinking, oftentimes even old books, they had wide margins so that you could write in it like little comments. And the next study who would see the text and the comments. So I think we're reviving that with the internet. Like it's only been 20 years now. It's amazing that we have this. But yeah, it's just so powerful.
Yeah, agreed completely on that. So what I appreciate you adding here is dialogue, as actually engaging in dialogue, is implying individual self-ownership.
Asserting, I would say asserting. You're asserting it, and whoever agrees to engage with you has to accept that reality.
Yes,
it's so implicit in the context.
And you're being receptive to, because you can't. It's not enough for me to just assert. That would just be fiat, right? If I'm just listen to what I say or else. It's like you have to be coming from a place of enough humility or receptiveness to understand that you're looking at an equal, right? Another self-owned, self-sovereign individual now sharing back at you things you may not see or understand, right? And Peterson has this great point. He's like, of course that's real. Like, try treating someone like that's not real. If I just treat you, if I put a label on you, oh, Tuur is just some Texan, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's got and I treat you that way, like, there's no dialogue occurring. Like, you're going to completely resent me. And there's no, so I don't know what the very simple argument, the way I try to describe individual self-ownership was okay, if I want to move my left arm, well, there it goes. I moved my left arm. Now, if I want to move your left arm, well, nothing happens. So it's like, yes, only you own yourself. Like, in a very physics sense, you own yourself. But this idea of, and then further, if you argue against individual self-ownership, so that was my simple example that people refuted and pushed back on. And I'm like, okay, maybe that's not enough. So then I try to take it a step further and said, okay, if you argue against individual self-ownership, if I sit here and tell you, I don't believe in individual self-ownership, I think it's wrong. Is that not an act of individual self-ownership for me to formulate my own opinion?
There you go. There you go. There you go. And as soon as someone can agree that we agree to disagree, that's where you got them. Because then if they think long and hard, and if they're logical, they'll end up with life, liberty, property right there. Yeah. As soon as they can agree, okay, well, I don't think you're a self-owner. And then you're like, okay, can we agree to disagree? And then they're like, yes. It's like, thank you.
Yeah, agree to disagree.
That's all it takes. Because then, but they have to think through the consequences of what they're saying.
Yes. And then what you just added to me was, okay, to argue against individual self-ownership is in fact an act of individual self-ownership.
Yes.
But also to discount another person's individual self-ownership, I guess I'm just kind of referring back to the earlier arguments. Like, it doesn't work. Like, people aren't labels, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? What's that? Is it Whitman? Do I contradict myself? Well, so be it. I'm vast and I contain multitudes. Like, everyone's like, like, of course, you see people expressing it everywhere all the time. Okay, that's incredibly helpful.
One concept we haven't mentioned, and this is just, it's not elaborate, it's not adding really, it's just a word that I think is vital to what we're talking about. So if I say you are not a self-owner, what I'm doing is engaging in a performative contradiction. Performative contradiction, like my act is self-contradicting. And so because what I'm not doing is validating the obvious context that we are engaged in.
So by saying that someone's not an individual self-owner as a human to a human, you're expressing your individual self-ownership, which would then imply, because they're a human, they're individually self-owned as well. Is that the contradiction?
Yes. And then like there's a similar argument for free will, right? And where, the stronger you're asserting, I don't have free will. Well, and I disagree with you. It's like, well, the fact that you even think it matters to have this discussion means that on some level, you do believe that you can convince me, and this free will is all around us.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. So it's a performative contradiction, but you can't argue against it without refuting the premise of the argument.
Yeah. The only thing you could do is, because that's ultimately when I've done this with people like who actually believe this stuff, that people don't self-own or don't have self-will. Ultimately, they'll say like, but what if I just hit you in the face? Or like, what if I just walk away? It's like, all right, well, you can choose to behave like an animal, but it doesn't mean that, it doesn't change reality. What is it? Ayn Rand is like, you can deny the reality, but you're not going to escape the consequences of reality or something like that.
Yes.
So it's like, it's self-defeating still, right? You can walk away, but it doesn't change reality.
It's still a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting. Okay. Let me ask you about that. This is a bit of a stretch maybe, but this idea of most, if not all, animals and organisms are territorial to some extent. I don't think it's all, actually. I read a book called The Territorial Imperative, and I'm pretty sure it made the case that most animals are territorial. And territoriality is a precursor to reproduction. Basically, you want the plot of land or the nest or whatever is particular to your species, so that you can show your competence as a member of that species and attract a mate to reproduce and pass on the genes, the Darwinian impulse. Is property the human institution we have wrapped our basic territorial impulse in?
I think maybe you could agree. You could agree with that, but I think it's dangerous, because any kind of comparison with the animal realm, you can get into these utilitarian rabbit holes, and you can start losing track of the fact that ultimately the individual is what's sovereign, and that having self-awareness, having access to reason, being able to go into engage in dialogue is what makes us human. And there's a phase shift there. Like it's a different dimension that we live in. So I'm always hesitant to be like, oh yeah, of course it's is that, but of course yes, to live together you need certain things, and maybe could you formulate it again? The is this that?
Yeah, I guess I'm asking about this in terms of establishing the genesis of property. Like freedom, for instance, in just a natural environment, freedom for a puma, right? The puma is only free to the extent that it can defend itself in its territory, right? And it's sort of true, again, I think, for humans, even if you look at us, look at the nation state, right? We've established a boundary, we've defended it. Within the boundary of that nation, we have created this social institution called property rights, that instead of it being kind of law of the jungle property, whoever can claim whatever territory, the biggest, meanest, we've instead tried to create a hierarchy based on competence instead of dominance, something like that. But I'm asking to see if, really, to put property in a more firm foundation. It's like, no, this is something like territoriality is something that's natural to life. We've just taken it and put it in this institution that instead of killing each other to take property, we can actually be like, go and be a good entrepreneur, serve the
Right.
interests of the consumer.
Right.
Then you can acquire more property, more territory, whatever you want to call it.
Maybe one way to talk about it would be that, like, scarcity is just a given. And so in order to navigate this scarce world, we need to like assert ourselves a little bit. Like we need some territory to have a little bit of abundance, to just have like that little bit. And then it's like, okay, but how do we negotiate the fact that we all need that? Well, what we want is a consensus over that principle, like that, even in practice, we might disagree on particular, property rights conflicts, but we agree on the concept. Like we agree on the kind of the whatever, we need the blockchain, the idea of like, this is how we do things. We that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, I think there is something very core. Like we need to displace air, right? I mean, we need to exist in reality. So it's just, you would be denying reality to deny that like that's maybe how you can get a socialist, is to be like, okay, well, how many atoms am I allowed to to take in this world?
Right.
Yeah, it's inevitable. We're going to take some space, and then we're going to bump into each other, and we need a way to navigate that, hopefully with just, you cannot never have conflict, but it's more about like, how can we, like,
how do you resolve it?
Yeah, how do you resolve it in a sustainable way? I think that's probably key, right? In a way that's repeatable, and that doesn't blow itself up eventually.
Yes. And so, I've had this series going on with Jason Lowery. I don't know if you followed much of his work on Twitter, but he has this power projection thesis about, I guess, sort of, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but sort of like that. Like you have to defend your property for it to be your property, basically. You can defend it yourself, you can outsource the defense, or you could just trust that someone won't violate your property. Trust is usually a pretty bad strategy, right? You need to have some mechanism of defense, whether that's rule of law, national border, whatever. But here again, we encounter what I think is a bit of a paradox, because, okay, we trust the nation state to secure us, to preserve this economic enclave, that we have strong property rights, we have access to rule of law for nonviolent dispute resolution over that property. But that very institution holding the monopoly on violence seems to inevitably turn on its own customers over time, right? And we're, again, back to taxation being that fundamental schism.
Yeah.
Like it's the only business in the world deriving its revenues from non-consensual exchange. And when it seems like when it hits a limit to its own growth, maybe either the market's not bearing enough revenue for it, that the state starts to lean into this violation of property rights via taxation. And maybe this is connected to the boom and bust business cycle too. Like we have the boom and bust business cycle through violation of property rights through currency debasement. Maybe we have a civilizational boom and bust.
Yep.
Because
like a fraud cycle. Like in my view, the business cycle is just one example of a fraud cycle. There's many.
Yes.
You can have them on very small levels. The ICO pump and dumps for fraud cycles. But yeah, you could argue that nation state to the extent that they're proliferating a lie, and then eventually that lie gets like snaps. That lie gets exposed, and then you have the downturn. It generates errors in society. People make decisions based on the lie, those accumulate, and eventually it all unravels. So yeah, I guess, we're back at that paradox about, war versus justice, or what did you say, property versus, maybe violence.
Contract versus conflict, I think I said.
Contract versus conflict, right. So I think something that is rather invisible, but I don't think you can deny it, is that, and you see this when you compare different cultures and countries around the world, is that the people that are the enforcers, are vastly in the majority. And like Game of Thrones has examples of that as well, where it's like, the slaves are far outstripping, the ruling class. And so I think the explanation, which is also the Deviate, like the book we're talking about, why does the king rule even though he's we're millions and he's only one. I think it's the programming. It's like there is a consensus about doing things a certain way. And so I would argue that it's the consensus, and the way to keep the consensus healthy is to have that continual dialogue, which is like the open source development. Like you keep stress testing and like launching things on testnet, and then eventually, you know, you have a BIP that gets accepted, and then gradually you build institutions in layers, you know. And in societies where that consensus is very brittle, you just have way more chaos, and you need a lot more enforcers. So that's I would argue to Jason, is that his name?
Yeah, Jason Lowery.
Yeah, I would say that it's not at the core is the consensus, and the consensus can be kind of can be brittle and fallacious and fraudulent, or it can be healthy and vibrant and all that. And that no army can fix anything. Like, you know, might doesn't make right. It can't. You know, the only thing you can do is maintain the consensus for longer. But if the consensus has a bunch of lies in it, it's gonna break down eventually. Like Raoul Pal, like suppressed volatility eventually leads to hyper volatility. So I don't, you know, I think it's dangerous to say, oh, we need all these enforcers and this threat of violence and all that. Of course, you know, like we were talking about the animal, you know, if you are debating with someone who cannot agree to disagree and they're going to attack you, well, yeah, of course, but that's part of the consensus. Like you want a healthy societal debate so that the dysfunctional fringe of society gets a proper response, where you can be like, all right, I'm going to close the door. And that's where you get into maybe, you know, you can blacklist certain people. You know, that's where insurance companies can play a role. You know, historically, you know, it was what's it called? Not extradition, but you would push someone out of the city, you know, if they continue. Exile, right? You know, if they continue, you push them out. Same with the family, right? Sometimes, you know, or in friendships, if someone keeps hurting people, then you can say, look, I'm not going to be friends with this person anymore. So I don't know, maybe that's kind of the start of a solution, is to like think about the thing that's often invisible is the consensus, you know, and then is the consensus healthy or is it more corrupt?
Right. No, that's helpful. I should condition a little bit of Lowery. So Lowery is actually a huge Bitcoin bull. And I think this is where he caught a lot of misunderstanding when he described this as a power projection thesis. He's describing power more from a physics sense.
Yeah.
So he's saying that we've needed what he calls kinetic power projection across history to establish property rights. That's the military, that's warfare, national borders. And he views Bitcoin as an electrical power projection alternative for establishing property. So that's, you know, that's hash rate, all of that.
Yep.
So
I think I agree on the physics level. But I would just say you're talking about restriction of access. So you're kind of like talking about a more primitive level. Restriction of access is the realm of technology, of, you know, that kind of thing. And then once you're talking about human conflicts, and of course, by using Bitcoin, we shrink the space of possible conflict, which is brilliant,
yes, exactly.
Right?
Yes.
And so the things that we need to have consensus over is way smaller. And it also kind of explains why people in the Middle Ages, why there was so much superstition, because they needed this big, thick layer of consensus to keep things kind of under wraps. Whereas with technology, we've been able to shrink that space.
Yeah, it's so damn interesting, because as you're describing this, the consensus, right, is a social technology in and of itself. However, we're establishing it. You know,
It's
Bitcoin,
software.
I would say, is the most efficient form we've ever had. But even medieval social consensus was there's a software program that people are sharing.
Yeah.
So is Bitcoin then as much of a praxeology protocol as it is an internet protocol?
Yeah, I would say like the cool thing about Bitcoin is that it's this technology layer that says, you know, restriction of access. So like we resolve a lot of conflicts before they can even happen, because it's like the North Koreans talking about stake is like, whoever wants to steal your Bitcoin, it's just like on the moon. It's you know, in a practical sense, if you use multi-sig and all that, it's out of reach. So it's not even an issue. But then the consensus about Bitcoin is probably very thin. It's probably just like the only thing we need is for people to agree to use it. That's all.
Yeah.
We don't need like a fat protocol about Bitcoin, because a lot of it is just is embedded in code. It's hard coded. It's technological, physical.
So it's so wild because, again, way out on a limb here, but we've talked a lot about useful fictions today, these social technologies and psycho softwares we're using. It seems like, to me, one of the keys to that, to making those useful fictions sustainable, is that they are maximally truthful and maximally useful.
Yeah.
And that's what Bitcoin is, right? Like, okay, if money is a map to the territory, if you will, of time and energy, well, Bitcoin maps to it perfectly. Like, it's
Right.
radical ownership, property independent of state coercion, immune to state coercion, as you said, if it's custodied properly. Doesn't that change everything? I mean, it changes us, right? It re-architects our own software over time, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think it really will. Like it's like, I don't want to overstate it in the sense that, similar to navigational technology and the printing press and all that, it was like an amazing shift change, but there are still problems in society. There's still like a need for flaw. It's like, if anything, it should reinvigorate us, because whatever conflict space is left is now smaller, and we can just be more deliberate about creating a better world for the next generations. Like it gives us a focus. Like, we don't have to debate about the Fed meetings and the Fed minutes, and there's so much energy is freed up to talk about the important stuff. We don't have to worry about money so much anymore, and investing and all that, boring stuff.
Yeah. Trying to outrun inflation and all of that.
It's like energy leaks. Like, in a way, like energy just kept leaking away with this, crazy bureaucratic financial system, and now it's just all like tightened up.
Yes.
Yeah.
I find myself coming back to this quote from Whitehead often, and I'm just going to roughly paraphrase it. But he says, civilization advances by the number of important operations we can do without thinking about them. And so, like you're describing, how many people are concerned about what Jerome Powell is going to say next week? And did he use significant, or did he use extreme, like the language, what clothes he's wearing? There's just all this human ingenuity and bandwidth pouring over the words from one guy.
Absolutely.
And it's like, that's all a waste. Like, all of that goes away in a Bitcoin world. It's like, there's been another block every 10 minutes, having schedules right on time. Like, you don't even think about it. It just is. So
absolutely. No, I agree on that. And especially prosperity. That's how prosperity advances, Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hey guys, I hope you found this episode valuable. At the What is Money Show, we are striving to deliver the most valuable knowledge possible in each and every episode. However, as Aristotle said, the purpose of knowledge is action, not knowledge. So I hope you're deriving some useful knowledge from the show, and I hope it's improving the actions you are taking in your life. Speaking of action, if you want to dive deeper into the big ideas explored in this show, please sign up for my newsletter titled The Freedom Analects at breedlove22.substack.com. Also, have you bought your tickets for Bitcoin 2022 in Miami yet? If not, it's your lucky day, as I am giving away 10 million sats, which is roughly $4,000 US, to one lucky person who buys a conference ticket through my affiliate link. My affiliate link can be found on my Twitter profile at breedlove22, which also has a link. My Twitter profile has a link to my link tree, which you can also visit my link tree directly for links to all my work, including Bitcoin 2022 affiliate sales. My link tree is linktr.ee/breedlove22. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys watching the show. I hope you're finding some valuable knowledge, in the What is Money show. And I'll see you back here again next time.